Hello and welcome to the presentation on the future of pesticides. My name is Tom Mueller. I'm a faculty at the University of Tennessee, and it's a pleasure to share with you here at the Grain Conference in this recorded presentation. A couple of topics to discuss. Let's look at each word in the title, The Future of Pesticides. First off, I'm talking about the future of pesticides. There's probably several different futures, so it's not only a single future that could happen. So this is really my opinion. The word future means what's going to happen in the days ahead. And I actually go back and look at what's a historical perspective on pesticides, and I spend quite a bit of time in the presentation on registration of pesticides. And so that's a major part of the presentation. And then pesticides are crop protection chemicals or active ingredients or chemicals that we use to help grow crops to largely prevent losses from various pest agents. So what I'm going to share today is have an introduction of some terms, and then I want to look back on the history of pesticides. I want to talk about right now, focusing on pesticide regulations, looking forward, and then having a few closing thoughts in the presentation. A couple of things which I am not going to cover today. There's nothing in this presentation about the COVID-19 virus, and I want to just share with you that the COVID-19 virus is a redundant term because COVID-19 means coronavirus infectious disease, year of origin 19. So saying it's a COVID virus is kind of like saying it's an ATM machine because an ATM stands for an automated teller machine. So if you say an ATM machine, you're saying machine twice. So anyway, just a little technical term on viruses and so forth. I'm also in this presentation making no comments on the University of Tennessee's football team or coaches or players, administration of any type. So that's not going to be covered. I'm also making no predictions on the weather in the future of 2021 and beyond due to global warming effects. Global climate changes effect. None of that will be covered in this presentation. The views and ideas expressed in this presentation do not represent the views of the University of Tennessee, nor the Department of Plant Sciences or the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. Mention of a product does not constitute endorsement of that product to the exclusion of other similar products. Some of this data is unpublished and subject to interpretation. I don't think there's any of my data in this presentation, but I just leave it in the disclaimer slide. At the direction of Angela McClure, I was asked to include humor in the presentation. So attempts at humor are made within this presentation, so viewer discretion is advised. In a moment of shameless self-promotion, I wrote a book, Farming is Not Big Gardening, and several topics, including the organic myth, pesticide regulations, neonicotinoids and pollinators, and just pesticides in general. There's a lot of information in this book related to the topic today of the future of pesticides, Endangered Species Act. So this is available at Amazon. The hard copy is way too expensive, but you can get it electronically for 20 bucks, which is it's worth 20 bucks. It's probably not worth $100, but it is worth 20 bucks. This is my grandson, Eli Fulton, and after extensive data searches, this is the most beautiful child in the universe. Now, some of you may have children or grandchildren, and you may think your child or grandchild is as cute as mine, but you're just wrong. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. And this child is the most beautiful human in the universe. And the crazy thing is, he almost always looks exactly like this. He's smiling, he's happy. Here he's just finished reading a book by Dr. Seuss, and he is just a joy, and it's just fantastic. So I apologize if that upsets you with your grandchildren because they're not. I'm not saying they're ugly. I'm just saying they're not as beautiful as my grandson. So let's talk about pesticides in the introduction. The modern era of pesticides began in the 1940s with the organochlorine, DDT insecticide, the auxin herbicides, and the huge benefits that they had were readily apparent. It is safe to say that the risks were not fully appreciated, And I remind you that there was no EPA or really much regulatory oversight. I make it analogous to the current situation with the hemp CBD regulations because there basically are no hemp CBD regulations and you can sell whatever you want. And in a way, that's kind of the way it was with pesticides. You want to make a chemical and sell it, you can make a chemical and sell it. That's kind of where we were. Some of the application images of DDT are just, and I didn't put them in here, okay? But the slogan is DDT is good for me, and they would have people like just being absolutely dosed with chemicals, and they really didn't understand some of the attributes of them, but bioaccumulation. But I mean, the truth is DDT was a very safe chemical that had huge benefits to humans. Paul Mueller won the Nobel Prize in medicine for his discovery of DDT, and because it so greatly helped with delousing and with malaria programs, and it's a tremendous advancement. And DDT is still used worldwide in Africa for malaria control programs in some countries. And there's a book that's called The DDT Story, and it fully explains this whole concept of the DDT. And this is referenced in Mueller's book. It's one of the few references I actually cite extensively in my book. So there's huge benefits to DDT. Other major events in the pesticide history are the use of Agent Orange use in the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the seminal book Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson in 1962. I would encourage you to read this book. It's a fabulous book. I have a whole chapter on it in my book, actually. And it's a fantastic book, and I encourage you to read it. And it just brings up the perspective, and a lot of people think the stuff in this book is true, which is not. But it still has a very good perspective on the use of chemicals. Richard Nixon, who people think was a bad president, but all things considered was probably a pretty good president, established the EPA in 1972, and this resulted in more stringent evaluation of pesticides. And in the early years, the mid-70s, glyphosate was labeled in 3 years, in 74 to 76, a very short time. I'm not going to say this will never happen again, but this will never happen again where a chemical can be labeled in 3 years. In the 1970s and 80s, there were many companies involved in the discovery of pesticides, and there was many new modes of action. It was a very exciting time for agricultural chemicals. And there was many new modes of action. In insecticides, we had organophosphates. That was probably actually in the 50s, I think. But we had pyrethroids, we have neonicotinoids, we have insect growth regulators. So several completely new modes of action were developed. In the fungicides, we had the carbamates, the triazoles, and the strobilurins. The strobes might have been in the 90s, but there was still an active time of discovery for fungicides. And the herbicides, I mean, I remember in the 80s and 90s, there was basically a new molecule every year. We had ALS, which is all the low use rate chemicals. You had glyphosate, PPO, HPPD, and many others. There was new herbicides virtually every year. There was something new coming out. Such is not the case, unfortunately. Well, the times changed, and the pesticide industry in the business climate, they say it's matured, which means that you cannot have increased sales because once you have 100% of every acre being treated several times, there's no more growth. Okay, so it's a mature industry. That means less profit to companies. Also, at this time, as the profits because of competition are being squeezed, there's more expense to discover and develop chemicals. Well, because the EPA keeps adding more and more regulations. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just saying that's what happened. So for this reason, many companies divested, which is a fancy way of saying they sold off, their ag businesses. And from a business standpoint, that makes complete sense. I mean, if my ag profits are 10% or so, that's what you're making. And you say, well, that's pretty good. Well, that's what it is. Well, pharmaceuticals, you could make more than 10%. I mean, there's many times that AstraZeneca has recorded gross profit margins of 40 or 50% over their whole year on all their products. I mean, think about that. I'm making 40% margin on everything. So we're now entering a current era of pesticides where there is a cost price squeeze of how things are going to be done. So that's where we are now. In the current situation, the pesticide evaluations, the chemicals used for crop protection are closely evaluated. The lead agency is the United States Environmental Protection Agency, but there's others that may be involved. The USGS service with navigable waters is a factor, the Endangered Species Act, which we'll talk about later. So now I want to share a perspective on the pesticide registration process. I am not an expert in the registration of pesticides. I have a good understanding of it, but I wouldn't consider myself that I know all the nuances. So I'm really happy to share the slides from a person named Jerry Wells. Jerry Wells is retired from Syngenta, and he gave this talk in 2016. To be honest, I don't know where he gave it, but I asked him if I could use these slides in other presentations. He was generous enough to let me use those. So I want to say that all the green slides, which are about 20 of them, are from Dr. Jerry Wells, retired from Syngenta. Really, a really good person. I really appreciate him allowing me to use his slides. So when we start the new product, the idea, we have a product. This is a natural product, and it's I think this is leptospermum is the chemical on the bottom. And they get this chemical, and they want to end up with a product that goes to the field. This happens to be Callisto, which is an excellent Syngenta product. And it has to go through the United States Environmental Protection Agency and several federal regulations. The objectives of the regulatory process is that the product will perform its intended function without unreasonable adverse effects on the environment, including a reasonable certainty that no harm will result from aggregate exposure to the pesticide chemical residue. So this is what the statutes say, and so let's go ahead and flesh out what this exactly means. When you're evaluating pesticide risk, there's two factors that go into the risk, and that's hazard and exposure. Hazard is how much would cause an adverse effect. It's something that will happen, and exposure is how much is there. You're going to have to exposure, and we'll talk about this as we go forward. So when we talk about the terms toxic or non-toxic, you say, well, stuff's non-toxic. Everything's toxic at levels. Aspirin has toxicity. Coffee has toxicity. On the top right, you say, well, what's that about? Well, sunlight has toxicity. The salt shaker on the bottom, salt is essential in low doses, but at high doses, salt can be toxic, especially to plants. I mean, you can put a bunch of salt in a plant and you can kill it. The stuff coming out of a stovepipe, it has toxicity. And of course, alcohol in low doses is a good thing, but in high doses, you can have toxicity to alcohol. So it depends on the dose whether something is toxic or not. So to reiterate, how can a pesticide be used to benefit agriculture without unreasonable effects on the environment and with reasonable certainty that no harm will result from aggregate exposure to the pesticide chemical residue? Well, we evaluate the pesticide risk looking at factors to the hazard or potential to cause harm, and then possible exposure routes. So possible hazards include toxicity to humans, wildlife, or plants, or for various attributes of surface and groundwater. Possible exposure routes include food, drinking water, residential use, handling and applying it, spray drift, and runoff. So those are the two factors in the risk equation. So if you look at this cup, this is a visual representation as where the line is on the cup is the amount resulted in a no observable adverse effect. And we'll talk about what that means with some pictures of lab animals. So if on the left side we have this amount results in no observable effects level in the hazard cup, and the exposure level is below that level, we can say what their risk is acceptable because the exposure is less than the hazard. Now let's talk about the various attributes of what can be the negative effects of pesticide use. You can have acute effects directly; it makes you sick and ill and so forth. And then you can have chronic effects where you have going from in a circle from the top around to the side, reproductive effects, developmental effects, immunotoxic effects, endocrine effects, other chronic effects, and mutagenic effects. And for each of these types of studies, there's targeted, expensive studies the registrants have to do to look at the mutagenic effects, to look at the reproductive effects, to look at the development effects. And one of the reasons why it's so expensive to get a pesticide registered, is because all of these expensive tox tests. And anytime you'll have a promising active ingredient and they're looking at it and it's really great on controlling pest X, whatever that is, and then they stop the development of it. Well, they'll say it failed a tox test. So let's say it has immunotoxic effect. Well, because of the toxicity, they have to stop the registration process of that chemical. Well, they might have spent $50 million on that chemical and they've just lost that money. So it's a really high risk kind of research to get it done. But these are the human health effects. So chronic toxicity testing is often over multiple generations. So what we have here is they use mice, lab rats, lab mice, whatever, and they dose them, feed them, or however they do it. So the dose range in this example is 0, 10, 100, and 1,000 milligrams, kilograms of body weight per day. So they dose them. And so at the lowest level, 0, you have no effect. At 10 milligrams per kilograms body weight per day, you have no effect. At 100, we'll have an effect. And at 1,000, you have the same effect, an increasing effect. So this would be the first level of toxicity screening. So the no effect level would be defined as 10, and the lowest effect level would be 50, because we would redo the study again and get those levels. So this is where the no effect level is observed, 10 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So now we've got our hazard level. Our hazard level is 10 milligrams per kilogram. That's our hazard level. But there's more, because we don't use the factor of 10. No, we have safety factors. So the first safety factor is, and it's represented by a picture of the mice, is there's a safety factor that says, well, the mice don't behave the same as humans. So let's add a factor of 10x. And then we have a bunch of pictures of humans, because we're making an assumption that humans don't behave the same as mice or rats, which in some situations is true, other situations it's not true, and that's beyond the scope of this discussion. I'm not going to get into the difference between humans and rats. Okay, I'm not going to do that. On top of that, at the bottom we have a picture of a baby, and I probably should have put a picture of my grandson Eli because he's cuter than this image, but that's okay. I mean, nothing personal. There's also a 10x safety factor for the difference between children and adult humans. So the no effects level is not 10 that they use in all their analysis. It's 1,000 times that level. The huge safety factors, it's almost nonsensical how safe these chemicals are. So the reference dose or point of departure is now 0.01 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So the exposure routes are the food, drinking water, or this is a image of a football player. And here again, we're not doing anything about Tennessee football. We're not covering that. That's not going to be covered. But if you're using pesticides on the turf and you fall down, you might get some residue, direct contact. So the exposure is coming in contact with the chemicals. So if my reference dose is 0.01 and my exposure is 0.0001, this is a safe use pattern for these chemicals. The exposure is less than the hazard level. So acute toxicity is from a single exposure. You get it in your eye, it's an irritant. This is if I'm drinking it, inhaling it, it gets on my skin, and it's a dermal. The lower right are examples of dermal exposure where I have dermal toxicity. So it's a single exposure. Another aspect of pesticide regulations that have really been more carefully examined is the risk to wildlife and environment. And many of these studies are very expensive to do. You have tests for birds and mammals, aquatic organisms, non-target plants, non-target insects, and you determine a lethal concentration of 50% of the population or a no observable effect level. And many of the tox studies are environmental tox studies looking at various attributes. For example, insecticides, a single pollinator study can easily cost $100,000 to conduct a long-term pollinator study, and that's a lot of expense. So it's safe to say that their pesticides are carefully evaluated for their risks to wildlife and the environment. So in a similar manner to the toxicity hazard equation, they estimate the risk to the environment by a risk quotient, where you take the hazard, the LC50, and you have the exposure level that is expected in the water, and you get a risk quotient, and you compare the risk quotient to the level of concern. And so that way, depending on how hazardous it is to the environment versus what's expected to be exposed in the environment, you can get a sense of what the issue is. And these can also be used in the labeling of the product, such that, don't use it in aquatic situations or so forth. Several factors are involved in the developmental costs and the timing in new developments. Endangered species, which we'll talk about a little bit more, bees, synergy, epidemiology, are all factors in the developmental cost. So this is the end of Dr. Wells' slides, and I just want to say I really appreciate him allowing me to use his slides in this presentation. So now let's talk about the current situation in pesticides. Well, there's only a few companies in the discovery of new active ingredients, and that is when I'm taking, and I don't know the active ingredient, I'm searching through libraries of different companies, and I'm trying to find, through a screening process, leads that are then optimized into final chemicals. But there's only a few companies in discovery, and that's because the cost is too great for small groups. If me and 10 guys want to get together and get a pesticide company, we don't have the resources to do it, because it takes about $400 million for a single active ingredient. And let's look at the math on this. I have 17 years of patent protection. So from the day I discover it, I have to patent it, or Lord knows everybody's going to steal it. I mean, there's enough people stealing stuff as it is, but that's beyond the scope of this discussion. So you've got 17 years of patent protection, but it takes 8, 10, or 12 years to get a label. So I've got to recoup all the costs and still make some money in 5 or 7 years or so. And you've got to have a pretty good gangbuster product to make that happen. So looking ahead, there's still going to be a need for pesticides, also called crop protection chemicals, because people want to eat. So now let's enter into a discussion of what's happening right now, and we're going to use a couple of illustrations. I'm going to tell a California story and then a dicamba story about what's going on right now, and then we'll get into what the future looks like. Well, there's going to be more restrictive regulations. For example, when you read the new dicamba labels, and it talks about a 200-foot setback or a 300-foot setback or a 110-foot setback, those are based on the Endangered Species Act. The setbacks in a field are for this, not for protecting crops. So I want to tell you a story about California pesticide use guidelines. California agriculture is an absolutely monstrous business, which I don't think most people fully appreciate. And the Great Central Valley of California is where a major portion of our fruits and vegetables come from. So if you're eating vegetables anytime, you're probably eating stuff that's been grown in California. And the California regulations of the California Department of Agriculture is extensive. And so there are many situations where I'm growing a given commodity crop. I'm growing green beans, let's say. And I want to put a pesticide use on there, pesticide application on it. In many situations, I have to get a prescription to use it. I have to justify why I'm applying this crop protection chemical. Now, I'm not sure of all the details on that. It may just be a rubber stamp, make a phone call, get an email, you're good. But it also may be, well, why are you using this? What kind of integrated pest management strategies are you using, and so forth. So it's not as easy as it is here. Because right now, agriculture in Tennessee is largely unregulated. You as an operator can choose which crop you want to use. You want to choose which fertilizer, which pesticides. That's pretty flexible, right? Contrasting that to California, that's not the way it is in California. That's not the way it is in other countries either. And how would you like that? How would you like it if they would say you can't grow that crop, or you can't use that fertilizer, or you can't use a given pesticide? How would you like that? My guess is you wouldn't like that. Of course, you say this will never happen in Tennessee, right? Well, did you ever think the government could tell you to stay at home, wear a mask, can't go to church, can't go to the bars? So if you think the government can't tell you what pesticide you can't use, you are not correct. So right now, as we look ahead or look right now, Europe, in my opinion, is on the way to regulating agriculture out of business because of all the very restrictive pesticide use patterns they have. Okay, for example, let's talk about paraquat. Paraquat is used for broad spectrum burn down weed control in Tennessee. Okay, you'll use paraquat. Gramoxone is one brand in Tennessee. How much paraquat do you think is used in Europe? Well, the answer is there's none because it's been completely outlawed. It's like DDT used in the United States. It's been outlawed. And why is that? Why is paraquat completely outlawed in Europe? Well, the reason is paraquat is acutely toxic. And unfortunately, about every 3 years or so, there is an accidental poisoning by ingestion in the United States. And tragically, it's often a child. And so this is a very horrendous situation. So the registrant, Syngenta, has developed a closed handling system. And this system has special connectors, so only large containers like mini bulks can fill sprayers directly with no human exposure. Now, could a smart person get around the system? Sure, you can always have an adapter that you can somehow get in and get a jug of it or something like that. They also added mandatory training, so you take gramoxone or paraquat training that you have to do prior to use. Well, let's just take a step back and say, well, if paraquat is so toxic, why not just cancel it like we do in Europe? Why not? I mean, it's just cancel it. Okay. Well, if it's just that toxic, just cancel use like in Europe. I just said that. Well, if no paraquat, what then? Well, you just use Roundup, right? No problem. Just use Roundup. Well, unfortunately, resistance will develop. And what I mean by that is Roundup used to kill everything, and now it doesn't kill the mare's tail. It doesn't kill the Palmer pigweed. It doesn't kill the goosegrass. It doesn't kill the Johnson grass. It doesn't kill, whatever. And the same principle applies in insecticides and fungicides. I mean, we used to have diseases of soybeans that were routinely controlled by different fungicides, and now they don't work anymore. Same thing with insecticides. Pyrethroids used to work a certain way, and now they don't work that way anymore. So looking at the point, unfortunately, resistance will develop and already has, and then the Roundup Power Max no longer works. So then you add another herbicide, and then another, and then another. So in reality, paraquat is an important herbicide-resistant management tool to keep Roundup working. And so far, with paraquat, there's more restrictions, more training, but can still use it. So far. So let's switch gears and talk about dicamba. This is the Tennessee Grain Conference, so we've got people who are familiar with dicamba. And let's just say there has been some alleged dicamba off-target movement in some states. I'm happy to say that with the good work of Steckel as our extension specialist and the good work of the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, I believe in Tennessee we've done a pretty good job of mitigating and eliminating off-target movement. It's safe to say that Steckel and Mueller, we do much research on dicamba off-target movement. And I just want to have a couple of points to observation. So Monsanto developed a non-volatile formulation and sold it in 2018, 2019, 2020. So they sold a non-volatile formulation. And I find it interesting how the new 2020 label requires an additional adjuvant to decrease the volatility of a non-volatile formulation. I'll let you think about that one for a second. So let's talk about off-label use. Now, there's several aspects of off-label use with respect to dicamba. Well, first off, if you do not use the registered product, you just use a generic dicamba. So that's obviously not going to work. But it's also off-label to use a higher rate of dicamba. Well, that's going to impact several things. First off, if I use a higher rate of dicamba, there's going to be more potential for off-target movement and volatility. But it's also, if there's Roundup in the tank too, that could have antagonistic effects on the grass control from the glyphosate, which is what we're seeing. Another aspect is that there's a cutoff date in these new labels. And so those are based on trying to minimize off-target movement. And I don't know what the cutoff date is going to be for soybeans and cotton. I don't know. I mean, right now they want to change the dates, but as I'm giving you this today, the label says June 30th for soybeans, but that might change. So read and follow all label instructions. The dicamba labels also had various use patterns, time of day inversions, and those types of things. And I remember in 2020, 2019, the label was basically impossible to legally use. And I just want to tell you that there is a biological versus a regulatory reality. The biology is the weeds are present, they're at a certain size, and they're at a certain susceptibility. And Dr. Steckel's work is showing that the dicamba products are failing with respect to controlling palmer pigweed. That's another topic. We also know from a biological agronomic perspective, I got a certain number of acres to cover, and I got to spray them once or twice, sometimes 3 times, depending on what I'm all spraying. So I've got this agronomic, biological, I've got to get these covered before they get a certain size of the weeds, versus the regulatory reality that are restricting when I can apply a given chemical. And there's times you're going to have to make a decision. Either I'm going to spray it off label or the weeds are going to get too big. And I'll let you think about that one too. So looking forward to the future, the label revisions will come. And every so many years, each pesticide label is revised. And the new aspects of the labels will include you must report failures due to resistance. There's going to be more training sometimes. I mean, there's some chemicals that probably won't have a lot more training because of their safety levels and so forth. It's quite possible you'll have greater buffer zones due to the Endangered Species Act. And in general, we'll probably have more restrictions in general on the use of chemicals. But hopefully it'll be balanced enough we can still use them to at least to some extent. So the label restrictions will come. And this is the way, this is going to be my opinion. If the applicators are good stewards and you follow the label by and large, then the labels will be as they are now. They're guidelines, and yes, there's some enforcement, but not too much. But if the applicators are not good stewards, then they will become mandatory rules. They will become inflexible, and there will be autocratic and more enforcement of the rules. And my analogy for this discussion is sort of like cars driving too fast through a subdivision. If the people are sensible, they drive slowly. If the people drive too fast, the people who live in the subdivision install speed humps or tables and make you slow down. In agriculture, I encourage all of us to be really good stewards and follow the labels as best you can, because we don't want regulatory speed bumps that put in our way and reduce our flexibility in our agricultural production systems. So I have a few clothing thoughts. Sorry for the extra bonus slides in there. In my book, I talk about the organic myth. Well, the organic myth is that people have this idea that organically produced products have no crop protection chemicals, and that's not true, because there are many insecticides you can put on organics because how they're made, they're not synthesized, they're from fermentation products. And in fact, fungicides, flowers of sulfur is used in some organic production systems at like 10 pounds an acre, 50 pounds an acre, huge levels. So if you think organic means pesticide free, that is not true. And it says that in the book. The glyphosate lawsuits ads have slowed down as we enter the end of 2020 and into 2021, but there's still some ads about the glyphosate lawsuit. I want to just say that was an economic decision by Bayer and not a technical decision, because glyphosate is still completely safe and allowed to use, and they just made the business decision to try to settle these lawsuits. So Roundup and affiliated products, I believe, are going to be important crop protection chemical for many years. But it just goes to show you that lawyers, if they can get glyphosate to be shown to be toxic, they can get anything to be shown, because glyphosate is an exceptionally safe chemical. The whole idea of neonic and pollinators and all insecticides and pollinators is an indication that there are going to be great challenges to pesticide regulations, because herbicides have to show that they're safe on pollinators. That's another expense that they have to have. And so the insecticides are being greatly challenged by the effect of pollinators. And I have a chapter on pollinators in the book too, by the way. It's safe to say that as our civilization develops, there's more stringent regulations. And I'm not going to make any political statements about how the last 4 years have been good with respect to regulations or bad. I'm not going to make that political statement. But I will say that in the future, we expect to have more stringent regulations of all things in the United States. Now, the next bullet point I have, EPA staffers are good. That doesn't seem to fit in the flow of things, but in the last few years, Dr. Steckle and I have been doing a lot of work in liaisoning and talking and discussing directly with EPA staffers with respect to the dicamba off-target movement. And I have heard many people who aren't really happy with the EPA for a variety of reasons, but all I can tell you is the people that I talk to directly with the Environmental Protection Agency are some of the most dedicated, hardworking, honest, intelligent people that I've ever met. And these people are on a very difficult task to weigh the benefit of a given crop protection chemical, this is dicamba, versus the risk of its off-target movement and what that causes. And all I have is nothing but good things to say about the US EPA staffers. And they care deeply about agriculture. They care deeply about the United States. And in a very difficult time, they are doing, I think, an outstanding, extraordinarily good job. And I have nothing but good things to say about the US EPA. That's my position, and that's really the truth. Okay, the next idea is the linkage of new active ingredients to new GMOs. This is mainly for herbicides. And what I mean by that is, historically, when you have a new mode of action, a new chemical, let's call it Mueller new herbicide, which would be great because I could use the money. So Mueller new herbicide, if I'm 20, 30 years ago, I have to screen the chemical to see if it kills weeds. That's good. But I also have to screen that it doesn't kill corn or wheat or soybeans or cotton. I got to have a major crop in order to sell it on. With the new transgenic technology, what they're going to do is they're going to develop the active ingredient to kill the weeds, and then they'll make a genetically modified organism or a transgenic soybean or corn or cotton or whatever that will tolerate the new active ingredient. And what this means for the company, that means they make money on the herbicide and on the seed, and they've got their intellectual property protection on both sides, plus taking money on the seed and the chemical. So there's a view in the industry that most of the new herbicides will be directly linked to a new transgenic trait that's going to come out. And yes, it costs more because you got to do the active ingredient and the transgene, but that way you make more money. And there is a view that this is why Bayer Crop Science bought Monsanto, because Monsanto really had no chemistry at all, but they had good capacity on the seed side. And Bayer had great capacity for herbicides, but they had no or limited capacity on the seed side. So that's why Bayer bought Monsanto. My next bullet point is it's easier to label for insects or diseases than weeds. So let's think about this. The pest similarity between a weed and a crop is pretty close. I mean, let's take Johnson grass control in corn. I mean, these are both C4 grasses. So how similar those are, they're pretty similar. I mean, they're very similar. So what will kill Johnson grass has a pretty good chance that it'll kill corn also. Well, how similar is a grasshopper to a corn plant? That's not very similar at all. So the level of safety is pretty easy. How close is frog eye leaf spot in soybeans related to soybeans as an organism? It's not very close at all. So one of the aspects of why herbicides are more difficult to label is because the safety of insecticides or fungicides is pretty easy. I mean, I can spray insecticides and fungicides on many, many different species of plants, but I've got to be very careful with herbicides for off-target movement. And my last major point is the gorilla in the room, which is pesticide resistance. And I have the analysis that pesticide resistance is like antibiotic resistance. And people, whenever you have small children, you take them to the doctor and you want to give them a pill. And so many times doctors, just because the parent just insists, they give them an antibiotic and just to make them feel better. Well, the truth is, as antibiotics start to fail and we have true antibiotic resistance, you can't take a pill or get a shot and that disease that was easily controlled before by that streptomycin now will not work because of the antibiotic resistance, because the resistance means it used to work, but now it no longer works. Well, the truth is, without new modes of action, pesticides will fail. And we see this all the time because the biology in the real world is diversity. And a field of soybeans doesn't want to be just a field of soybeans. It wants to have lots of different weeds and maybe some insects in it and a bunch of diseases. And that's what the natural system is. And we are, as farmers, we're swimming upstream against a biodiversity gradient. Because when I plant soybeans on that field, I want soybeans. And that's all. But the natural system is it's going to have a lot of different things. And it's going to select for resistance, so that Roundup, which worked perfectly well 20 years ago, it isn't going to work. So I add the dicamba, and it's not going to work after 2 or 3 years. So I have to have something else to put in there because people want to eat. And that pesticide resistance really is the gorilla in the room, and we need to address that real issue. So in conclusion, I just want to say that pesticides are used because they're effective, they're economical, and they're environmentally sustainable, and they are safe when used correctly. I want to just say I really appreciate Dr. Jerry Wells allowing me to use the slides, and I really want you to always read and follow all label instructions for all crop protection products. And if you want to buy this book, it's available at Amazon.com. Thanks for listening.